Inside Oxford's Ashmolean Museum, in a small glass case within a room devoted to Saxon archaeological finds, is a tiny jewel over 1,000 years old. There is an inscription on it that reads, when translated, "Alfred ordered me to be made." And a stained glass window in Christchurch Cathedral tells the story of a princess called Freiswide. She was determined to become a nun, and fled the attentions of her ardent suitor, who pursued her in flight. She summoned the gods to her aid and blinded him. When she repented and restored his sight, she was canonized and founded a priory here over 10 centuries ago. Both the window and King Alfred's jewel provide 2 legendary clues to the origins of a place that was destined to become one of the most important cities in English history. When you hear the word Oxford, what springs to mind? The quads and cloisters of its ancient colleges, the bright young things of the 20s, eccentric dons and their students riding about on their bicycles, or the boat race, the summer balls. The point is surely that Oxford is not just one of these things, but all of them. And this is its enduring fascination. The story of Oxford is the story of an extraordinary city, one that has taken centuries to unfold. Today it is the famous colleges with their splendid architecture and quirky traditions which draw visitors to the city, but there was a university here long before all this was even dreamed of. And that surely is where our story must begin. Medieval England. Our mental picture at this time is one of knights and castles, kings and crusades. It is often easy to forget the harsher aspects of medieval life. Most of the population were engaged in a struggle to survive, eking out a living, working the land as peasants on the great estates. There was neither the time or the money to indulge in such frivolous things as an education. The centers of learning at this time were the abbeys or monasteries. The church was anxious to hold on to this monopoly of education to secure its power for the future, and so it was out of these religious institutions that the universities were born. Oxford was no exception. By the 12th century, several monasteries had been established near the city, and it quickly gained a reputation for academic excellence. A medieval student who had come to Oxford in search of an education would have lived in halls or lodgings rented from a local landlord. Conditions were often far from luxurious, as many of the students were extremely poor, and sometimes to earn a little more money, the poorer students would act as servants to the richer ones. They spent their money on paying for the services of a master who would lecture them in the basics of logic, rhetoric, and arithmetic. If they were diligent, they could then progress to the all-important study of theology. It was a pretty daunting prospect, as it took 16 years to get a master's degree. As more and more students arrived in Oxford, so the relationship between town and gown, as it is known, deteriorated. On St. Scholastica's Day in 1355, at the Swindlestock Tavern, a fight broke out between a couple of students and the locals. Someone summoned more people to the fight by ringing the bells on Carfax Tower. The situation quickly developed into a full-scale riot, and 63 students were killed. Given this sort of atmosphere, it is quite surprising that anyone got any work done at all, which was perhaps part of the inspiration for the building of the colleges. Indeed, Walter de Merton, who founded Merton College in 1264, insisted that his students were chaste, peaceable, and humble, and spoke to each other only in Latin. Here in Merton's Mob Quad, the oldest quad in the oldest college in the university, you cannot help but feel the monastic tranquility of the place, an ideal environment for the quiet pursuit of learning. Within these fortress-like walls and along these hushed cloisters, even the roar of Oxford's traffic is reduced to an unobtrusive murmur. The colleges were designed as enclosed worlds of their own, self-contained scholarly communities, full of little rooms, courtyards, alleyways, and enchanted gardens. Merton acted as a design blueprint, and later colleges were built along similar lines. The quadrangles, some of which are cloistered, link all the different parts of the colleges together. Research was carried out in the library, always built on the upper floors to keep the books from the damp. Here were kept the precious illuminated manuscripts which took so long to produce they were often chained to the desks in case they were stolen by an overzealous student. The monastic origins can be felt even in the seating arrangements in the dining room. At the high table sit the master and the fellows of the college. Below them, along these long refectory tables, would have sat the students who might have discussed their day's work, or more likely moaned about the quality of the college food. In our largely agnostic and scientific world, it is often difficult to appreciate what a powerful force religion was in the medieval mind. An enduring testament to this overwhelming religious influence is Oxford's skyline, punctuated by the spires and steeples of its college chapels. They represent a world that was built on faith, but a faith that was about to be challenged by new and revolutionary ideas. By the 13th century, a mood of change was sweeping through Europe. The Protestant movement in Germany was challenging the authority of the Catholic Church. In Oxford, where the study of theology was of major importance and where academic minds were asking questions about things which had always quietly been left unanswered, the new ideas were bound to catch on. As a result, Oxford became embroiled in the turmoil of a religious tug-of-war that lasted for centuries. Henry VIII broke with the Catholic Church and set himself the head of the church in England. The dissolution of the monasteries followed, and religious institutions were purged of all associations with Rome. A stained glass window in Christchurch contains a small but poignant reminder of this struggle. If you look closely at the window, you will notice that one of the figures doesn't have a face. It has been replaced by a piece of pink glass. The faceless man is Thomas à Becket, former Archbishop of Canterbury, who had in another century crossed his king by taking the Pope's side. It is said to have been removed in Henry VIII's reign to eliminate the painful association forever. Henry VIII's daughter Mary was a staunch Catholic, and when she became queen, she tried to reverse everything that her father had done. In Oxford, as elsewhere, Upholders of the new Protestant ideas were hunted down, accused of heresy, and condemned to death. A monument in St. Giles near Broad Street commemorates the death in 1555 of the three Protestant bishops, Latimer, Ridley, and Cranmer. Cranmer, who was imprisoned in St. Michael's Tower, which is all that's now left of what used to be the Bocado prison, was forced to watch from the window of his cell whilst his colleagues were burnt at the stake. A fate which awaited him a year later. Outside Balliol College, at the end of Broad Street, there is a cross in the middle of the road which marks the spot where they suffered their terrible end. And Balliol still retains the old doors which bear the blackened scars of that appalling fire. But again, change was coming from Europe, this time in the form of the Renaissance. And Oxford, with its enlightened and wealthy patrons, reaped the benefit of this new age. Here, in the old Divinity School, the university's first lecture hall, students would have debated theological issues beneath this marvelous fan-vaulted ceiling. But you've only to step out of the cool gloom of that medieval building into the school's quadrangle, built next door in the early 1600s, to see the new influence everywhere. This was the heart of the university, and the signs above the doorways show the new subjects which began to grow in importance. Nowhere is the spirit of the Renaissance better illustrated than in the Tower of the Five Orders at the far end of the quadrangle. Every turn of the stone reflects the Greek and Roman influence which inspired this new ideology. Its figurehead is King James I, and it houses what is certainly one of the most famous libraries in the world. The university has always had books. They are, after all, one of the most valuable tools we have for the communication of ideas. And in one form or another, the university has always had a library. The first was little more than a chest locked away in the university church, which contained a few handwritten manuscripts. But this magnificent room, where the books rise from floor to ceiling, was the labor of love of one man. His name was Sir Thomas Bodley. He approached the university with the intention of replenishing an earlier library which had been ransacked during the dissolution of the monasteries. His qualifications, he said, for taking on such a task were that he had enough time and enough money to do it. And so he began, helped by his many friends, to put together this place that now forms part of a gigantic institution which has fittingly become known as the Bodleian Library. The library expanded very quickly, first into the specially commissioned school's quadrangle, and later into the Radcliffe Camera. Without doubt, one of Oxford's most famous landmarks. In our own age, the library is still expanding into the new Bodleian on the other side of Broad Street. Rather in keeping with its forbidding and fortress-like exterior, its basement contains huge underground vaults. If a student in the main part of the library requests a book that is not on the shelves, it is collected from the vaults and transported underneath Broad Street through a long subterranean tunnel and brought up to one of the reading rooms ready for collection. Sir Thomas Bodley arranged with the Stationers' Company that a copy of every single book published in England should be sent free of charge to Oxford. In our information-hungry century, when the number of publications has increased beyond the wildest imaginations of our predecessors, this presents something of a challenge. requiring the addition of nearly 2 miles of shelving every year. Hundreds of thousands of books, many of them rare, and original manuscripts are stored in these rooms stretching 3 floors below ground level. Sir Thomas Bodley would have been impressed. It is an interesting fact that during the English Civil War, when Charles I had made Oxford his capital, and the city was under siege from Cromwell's parliamentary forces, Charles sent a note down here to this library asking to borrow a book on other civil wars from the library's famous collection. His request was flatly refused. The library never lends books, they said, not even to the King of England. Charles had come to Oxford following the Battle of Edge Hill to escape from Oliver Cromwell, and he stayed for the next 4 years. He made his headquarters at Christ Church, which was rather appropriate given that another king, Henry VIII, had founded it. The enclosed stone wall buildings made it an ideal stronghold. Architecturally, it is perhaps the grandest of the colleges, and it was in every way a palace fit for a king. He even appointed a master of revels to arrange theatrical and musical entertainment so that court life could carry on much as it had done in London. The Queen held court at Merton, which is just next door. And a little gate was made in a garden wall adjoining the 2 colleges so that the 2 of them could see each other whenever they felt like it. Indeed, the whole of the university was transformed, geared now to supplying the demands of an occupying army. Magdalen was turned into an arsenal, as was New College. Brasenose became a gigantic larder to feed Charles's troops, and Convocation House at the rear of the Divinity School, where university decisions had always been taken, became the King's new Parliament, one of the only places outside London where Parliament has ever been held. Of course, all this cost a lot of money, and the King certainly didn't have it. So he solved the problem in a typically regal fashion. He decided to make it himself. The Royal Mint was set up in Oxford, and gold and silver plate, requisitioned from the college's prize collections, was melted down and turned into coins. But Charles knew it couldn't last forever. He was losing the war, and Cromwell's army was getting ever closer to the city. His life was in danger, and finally, in April 1646, he fled. The king was captured and beheaded in London. Cromwell became Lord Protector of England, and a new force of Puritan austerity swept through the nation. He became Chancellor of Oxford in 1650 and ruthlessly rooted out Royalist supporters in the university. But despite this instability, Oxford was back on course as an academic institution. Great advances were made, particularly in the sciences. It was an age of experiment and investigation. Old mysteries were dispelled and new worlds were opened up by the power of the lens, looking inwards at the tiniest organisms on a microscope and outwards at the stars and comets as Sir Edmund Halley had done with his telescope. Halley, most famous for the comet named after him, lived in New College Lane and had a small observatory built on the top of his house. He was a member of the Royal Society, founded at Wadham College in about 1660 to encourage the pursuit of science. The famous physicists Robert Hooke and Robert Boyle also lived and studied in Oxford. They conducted experiments on the behavior of gases, and it was the work of men such as these that helped to place Oxford at the forefront of scientific research. There was another member of the Royal Society, one of Britain's foremost architects. His name was Christopher Wren, and it was through him and others like him that the elegance of the age found its expression in architecture. Of course, one of the problems that the university had to face was this stuff, coffee. Coffee houses had become enormously popular by the end of the 17th century, proving too much of a temptation for students to resist, and many of them much preferred to while away their days in these smoky dens than to tax themselves in the library. The 18th century was the age of the dandy, and although there were some brilliant minds at work during this time, like Dr. Johnson, John Wesley, the university became something of a playground for the rich and fashionable young men. But it clearly wasn't just the students who were to blame. The academics were often as much at fault. In those days, examinations were conducted orally, and the results were often farcical. A well-known noble of the time recorded the following dialogue on the occasion of his examination in Hebrew and history. Examiner, what is the Hebrew name for the place of a skull? Scott. Golgotha? Examiner, who founded the University College? Scott, wisely sticking to the legend, King Alfred. Examiner, very well, sir. You are competent for your degree. That examination took about 30 seconds, surely one of the quickest examinations of all time. However, thanks to the reforming spirit of the Victorians, they were soon to become a rather more testing affair. For some, entering this room can be a rather daunting prospect. For these are the examination schools, where apart from the tick from that gigantic clock and the scribble of pens flying across the page, everything is conducted in absolute silence. One of the principal reformers was William Gladstone, Prime Minister of England and a former student of the university. His political future was suggested by his brilliance in the debating chamber in the Oxford Union, which soon became a nursery for budding young politicians and diplomats. The Victorian image of the English gentleman was born. But what about the English woman? For 800 years, Oxford had been an impenetrable male bastion, and there was perhaps no change more radical in its long and turbulent history than that which finally opened the doors to women. It doubtless raised a few eyebrows in its time with the first of the women's colleges like Lady Margaret Hall and Somerville were founded. And when the dons who previously had led a rather cloistered and monkish existence were finally allowed to marry and live domestic lives outside the walls of their colleges, the last traces of a monastic and medieval tradition were blown away like cobwebs from an ancient vault. Almost as if to spite this progress, the architecture of the time looked back to the medieval origins of the university. This is William Butterfield's Keble College. with its elaborate details, its spangled brickwork, and its Gothic decoration. It is an enormous and unavoidable testament to Victorian taste. You either like it or loathe it. John Ruskin, one of the most influential figures in Victorian society, absolutely hated it. It so offended him that he gave up his evening walk in Oxford to avoid having to look at it. But Ruskin could hardly have objected to the University Museum built on the other side of the road because he partly designed it himself. He even had a go at putting up one of the pillars that support the roof, but it was deemed so unsafe they had to pull it down and start again. This building may also have had its critics, but no matter what anyone thought of its architecture, they couldn't fail to be impressed by its contents. The building of the museum coincided with the publication of Darwin's controversial Origin of the Species, and is the home to thousands of specimens gathered from explorations from all over the globe. Some are curious but recognizable. Others are certainly not. For many Victorians, it must have been a breathtaking display of the world's wondrous variety. And through a doorway at the far end of the museum is one of Oxford's true treasures, often referred to as the city's best kept secret. The Pitt Rivers Museum is the extraordinary bequest of one man's obsessive collecting. It is an impressive illustration of that odd blend of romance and scientific curiosity that was so much part of the Victorian mind. But perhaps the most famous exhibit in the University Museum was this rather peculiar-looking bird. Although it had long been extinct, the dodo was brought back to life in the 19th century by the imagination of a quiet Oxford don. His name was Charles Dodgson, better known as Lewis Carroll, and his story is probably one of the best-loved children's books in the world. Alice in Wonderland. It all began here, one day in 1862, the Dean's Garden at Christ Church, one of the most private and secluded spots in Oxford, and you're not normally allowed to see it. Lewis Carroll, who was something of an amateur photographer, was trying to get a particularly tricky photograph of the cathedral. The Dean's children, one of whom was Alice Liddell, were playing in the garden, and like most children were desperate to get into the picture. This close friendship between Carroll and the children blossomed throughout that summer. Carroll was a clever, rather shy man who enchanted his newfound friends with his crazy, spontaneous stories, peopled with odd characters doing even odder things. He would often take them on boating expeditions to while away the long summer afternoons. And it was as a result of one of these trips that Alice in Wonderland was born. Alice Liddell suggested to him that he should write it all down, which he did, embellishing it with his own drawings. Later that year, he gave it to her as a Christmas present.
For the visitor to Oxford, it also makes a fascinating exercise in detection. Carroll spent his whole life here, so it is not surprising that the scenes and characters in his book should have been drawn from real people and places in the world he knew and loved.
She was a little startled by seeing the Cheshire cat sitting in the bough of a tree a few yards off. The cat only grinned when it saw Alice. It looked good-natured, she thought. Still, Alice rubbed her eyes and looked again. She couldn't make out what had happened at all. Was she in a shop? Or was that really? Was it really a sheep that was sitting on the other side of the counter? Rub as she would, she could make nothing more of it. She was in and found herself in a long, low hall, which was lit up by a row of lamps hanging from the roof. "Curiouser and curiouser," cried Alice. "Now I'm opening out, like the largest telescope that ever was. Goodbye, feet." Just at that moment, her head struck against the roof of the hall. In fact, she was now rather more than 9 feet high, and she at once took up the little girl.
And Oxford itself, with its rabbit warren of alleyways and crooked streets, once it had been filtered through his imagination, was a perfect backdrop to the bizarre landscape of wonderment. She came upon a low curtain she had noticed before, and behind it was a little door about 15 inches high. She tried the little golden key in the lock, and to her great delight, it fitted. Alice opened the door and found that it led into a small passage, not much larger than a rat hole. She knelt down and looked along the passage into the loveliest garden you ever saw. How she longed to get out of the dark hall and wander among those beds of bright flowers and those cool fountains.
It is rather appropriate that this most extraordinary of fairy tales should have been inspired by Oxford, a city which has so often been seen as a fairy tale place. But for many people, the word Oxford conjures up not the dodo or the Queen of Hearts, but the almost mythical Oxford of the 20s, Brideshead revisited, populated by rich, idle young men passing 3 idyllic and decadent years, barely disturbed by the need even to pick up a book.
Certainly from the end of the 19th century until the 30s, there was an easy graciousness about the place. Despite the educational reforms, the colleges had strong contacts with many of the top public schools, and entry requirements were often waived by those colleges looking for their quota of gentlemen and sportsmen, renowned more for their breeding and elegance than their academic prowess. The First World War was a chilling reminder of a more sober reality. Nearly a whole generation was sent off to the front line. The plaques and memorials in the colleges bear testament to the number of undergraduates who died in the fighting. But in the Champagne and Charleston of the 20s, the world gave a great sigh of relief, and for some, their time at Oxford was one long, long party. Fortunately, the wealthy gentlemen would be attended to by a college scout, who would wake their delicate charges gently after a night of high living.
Whether the summers were quite as long and idyllic as Evelyn Waugh and Sebastian Flight would have us believe doesn't really matter. The abiding image is of an afternoon, sipping champagne whilst punting down the river in the golden sunlight.
But it was the Second World War that finally shattered the tranquility of those summer days and shocked the world violently into the 20th century. Britain rallied its forces against the terror of Adolf Hitler, but even he was caught by the charm of Oxford. He refused to allow the Luftwaffe to bomb the city, having decided to make it his capital. after he had invaded England. During the war, life in Oxford went on, and the university's contribution to the war effort was in the vital research it carried out. One man in particular was engaged in work which by the end of the Second World War was to save countless thousands of lives. It was here, at the Radcliffe Infirmary, that Howard Florey first administered a new experimental drug to a human being. The story had begun 10 years before, when a scientist in London called Alexander Fleming observed that germs in a laboratory petri dish were being destroyed by a growth of mold. From this unlikely beginning, one of the most vital drugs in modern medicine was stumbled upon. It was called penicillin, and the science of antibiotics was born. The growth of science was greatly helped by the patronage of Lord Nuffield. He had made his fortune in Oxford as William Morris, feeding the students' almost insatiable appetite for bicycles. From one small bicycle shop, he soon graduated to motorcycles and finally began to make motor cars. When he opened his factory just outside Oxford, he began to produce them on an enormous scale. He repaid his debt to Oxford by donating money to the university to spend on research facilities. Now, Nuffield College bears his name and adds another spire to Oxford's famous collection. For the university, it was the beginning of the modern age. Over a third of students study a science-based subject, quite a change for a university where at one time nearly everyone studied theology. For the students today surely have the best of both worlds, with every modern resource and convenience at their fingertips in a setting which evokes all the romance and grandeur of the past. It offers a world of opportunity which for 3 years is theirs for the taking. Oxford has long ceased to be the preserve of the wealthy sons of the aristocracy. Today it is ability rather than money which buys the students a place here. They come from all walks of life and from all over the world, drawn to a place whose reputation precedes it by about 800 years. Oxford has come a long way from its humble medieval origins. The modern-day university is made up of over 30 different colleges, and it is one of these that the students join when they apply to the university. The university oversees the activities of the colleges and provides lectures and laboratory facilities in all the different subject faculties. But it is in their colleges that the students will eat, sleep, and work. And it is the colleges which uphold the weekly one-to-one tutorial system, now almost unique to Oxford.
Drug or violence, as long as they've got enough support, and at the moment there isn't enough support to look after those people.
You have to be bright and you have to work, but the reward for passing the grueling final examinations, whether due to continued effort or last-minute swatting, is worth working for. An Oxford degree is still an invaluable seal of approval. Like most universities, however, Oxford offers more than 3 years' hard labour. At Freshers' Fair, the new students have an opportunity to join a bewildering array of clubs and societies parading themselves to lure the students away from the earnest pursuit of learning. Some of them are serious, others are deliberately absurd.
Madam President, honourable members, any regime that denies the majority of its citizens political rights on
For
the
the
basis
students,
of their race,
as for their illustrious
23
predecessors
million of them
participating in
to
some of these
homelands
societies,
and
like
keep
the
them there
Oxford
with
Union
armoured vehicles
Debating
to
Society,
preserve our
can be a
utter
vital
population.
first step to their future career. For the competitively minded, there is no shortage of opportunity. The colleges compete fiercely for supremacy, and Summer 8's, a week-long regatta, is a highlight of the sporting calendar. For the best of the college oarsmen, success offers a chance to represent the university in the boat race against Cambridge, which has been held annually for over 100 years. But what is it that makes Oxford so unique? It is a university town like so many others, but yet it is much more than this. Perhaps the answer lies in its extraordinary combination of past and present. In its research and development, it is at the very forefront of the modern age, and yet the 20th century can still be held at bay by the stately ceremonies of the past. Dusty old tradition, perhaps, but still totally irresistible. For most of the students, this romantic combination of fact and myth is like a charm that draws them here. Like most myths, it is largely illusion. The Oxford of Brideshead Revisited no longer really exists, but its slightly faded elegance lingers on in the parties and the summer balls. And who can blame the students in their 3 short years for trying to recreate it?
It is perhaps right that we should end here in Wren's Sheldonian Theatre, built as a venue for all university ceremonies. It is here that the students begin and end their academic career. They arrive straight from school, fresh-faced in their gowns and white bow ties, to be officially welcomed by the university at a ceremony called matriculation. 3 years later, they return to graduate. But how much has passed in between? The students will leave Oxford, but they will never forget it. In return, they will never be forgotten, for it is they who breathe life into the university. Each year, a new intake of students will trample through its colleges and cobble streets, leaving just a little trace of the present on the past. The story of Oxford is one of continual change. Its richness and diversity is a work of history. Its variety is its magical appeal. Oxford touches everyone. And perhaps no one has captured its beauty better than Henry James.
I walked along through the lovely Christchurch meadow,
By the riverside and back through the town. It was a perfect evening, and in the interminable British twilight, the beauty of the whole place came forth with magical power. There are no words for these colleges. As I stood last evening within the precincts of mighty Magdalen, gazed at its great, serene tower, and uncapped my throbbing brow in the wild dimness of its courts, I thought that the heart of me would crack with the fullness of satisfied desire.